I'd now like to introduce our afternoon session, which is called Making Progress in the Treatment of Kidney Disease. And our moderator will be Kevin Fowler from the Patient and Family Partnership Council. So Kevin, would you like to introduce our first speaker?
Sure. Thanks, Kathy. I'm going to introduce our next session. Is called Making Progress in the Treatment of Kidney, or Innovations to Accelerate Therapeutic Development. And the speaker for that is Dr. Barbara Gillespie. Dr. Gillespie is a board-certified nephrologist who completed her residency in internal medicine at the University of North Carolina and her nephrology fellowship at Duke University. She's currently a vice president at Covance Global Clinical Research Organization, where she is a therapeutic head of nephrology and will continue to support sponsors on CKD drug and clinical device development. She's also an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina Division of Nephrology and Hypertension. Barbara is currently on the board of directors for the Kidney Health Initiative and a member of several work groups: endpoints in IgA nephropathy, barriers to CKD, patient participation in CV trials, and endpoints for FSGS. Prior to Covance, Barbara worked at Quintiles, currently known as IQVA, for 11 years, and most recently reported directly to the Chief Medical and Scientific Officer to support issues related to strategy, science, ethics, and governance, with a focus on medical expertise integration. She is a past head of the North American Internal Medicine Medical Team and was a team leader for 8 physicians reporting to her. As a global nephrology lead, she led CKD and ESRD trials from protocol development to trial execution, served as a consultant to sponsors for clinical development plans, due diligence, regulatory submissions, commercialization plans, health economic outcomes, research, and patient-reported outcomes. Her roles also included executive sponsor on a strategic partnership and member on a steering committee and a scientific ad board. She participates in several advisory boards and our stakeholder panels, including the FDA, EMA, NKF workshop on renal endpoints, and invited to participate in the March 2018 meeting. NKF CKD Registry, which is her role as scientific ad board, UNC's PCORI grant on building research capacity in the dialysis community, and the Global Standardized Outcomes for Nephrology SONG initiative. Barbara also served on an independent endpoint education committee for Global CKD and CV Outcomes program. She's an associate medical director at a small local dialysis unit, a fellow of ASN, and received board certification in internal medicine in 2004 and in nephrology in 2006 and 2015. Barbara, all yours.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. And I have two challenges today, and is this okay? First of all is some people are still eating. I'm postprandial. I just ate really quickly. But I think this is a really great session to end up with, because we do want to talk about innovation, accelerating, being creative, expediting therapies. And the word I loved, of the many things that came out yesterday, the word I loved from Bruce was impatient. I can be impatient at times in my professional and personal life, but this sense of urgency is something that we've kind of been living with the last few years, but for whatever reason at this meeting this year, I'm feeling that sense of urgency louder, and I'm proud of that. So where's the... Okay, whoa. Okay, so a few weeks ago, a person came up to me and said, wow, patient-centeredness is just so trendy these days. They had done a Google search and counted all the hits. And I looked at them and just realized, maybe folks don't realize this, but this isn't a trend. It's mandated. And so I want to start with the 21st Century Cures Act back in 2016 when it was passed. Here you can see the 4 titles, and for today I'll focus on the title under development, which is really to speed up development. I'll touch upon patient-focused drug development and experience data, novel trial designs, and real-world evidence. On the left, I'll also mention an example of personalized medicine in CKD. The other challenge I want to say that I have is when we talk about innovation in trial design and conduct in nephrology, this is usually a 1 or 2 day full meeting where we're locked in a room and everyone has something to say. So I'll try to do this in 15 minutes, but I do hope that at the panel and QA session, people have more to say. So we all recall that 2004 publication of the graph that showed that nephrology trials were the lowest in number compared to other therapeutic areas. I'm glad that no one has shown that graph in the last few years of meetings, because my view in 2018 is depicted here. It's my little drawing on the slide. But from a paucity of CKD trials, I've seen this burst of collaborative efforts and hope. And I think hope is really important, because I attended that cardiovascular meeting and we sat through a panel of the 10 heart failure trials that had failed in the last few years. There was a patient sitting on the panel, and when he turned to the cardiologist and said, okay, I hear all these trials are failing, but what hope can you give me to take back to the patient community? And they're kind of crickets. And I think if that was in a nephrology meeting, no offense to our cardiologists here, Chuck and Rahul, I think we've got more hope to offer. But we're also learning from our cardiology colleagues. Well, the 2004 publication was a call to action, and many of us in the room have reacted to it, because we know that the best way to predict the future is to create it. So I'm not going to go through all these boxes, but I wanted to show my selected timeline of what I see that have been great efforts to improve trial design and conduct. Now, remember, we've been continuing to conduct trials all along, but we've also taken pause to see why some of them have failed. And so the thing that we're learning from the cardiologists is that when you fail, don't just kind of keep going, but take pause and understand why they failed. Is it problems with the endpoint, with the design, with the conduct? And so you can see lots of good groups globally talking about these things. Additionally, when I sat down to think about this a few months ago, I did a literature search. Again, not looking for trial results, but I was happy to see that there was a bolus of CKD publications, 16 on lessons learned alone in trials, and 7 papers on endpoints in nephrology. So this is huge progress. And here are some of the papers listed here, and I haven't checked this in a few months, so I'm sure there's more in 2018. But I do want to go back to the reality, and this came up yesterday, that since 2007, there have been only 6 new molecular entities approved in the US for CKD. And one of them was withdrawn within a year because of safety issues. But this does not include the drugs that were initially approved for a non-renal indication and now have an extended approval. So tolvaptan, first approved in 2009 for hyponatremia and just approved for PKD just last month. So that's something to celebrate. And in addition is we continue to go at it. So this is a nice pictorial of how many interventional ongoing CK trials that are actually categorized in clinicaltrials.gov, and this was a few months ago. You can see the categories broken down there, and this is likely an underestimation, because if you go into ClinTrials and you start putting more specific search terms like hyperoxaluria, IgA, FSGS, I bet you would see more trials. And the reason I show this is because when I met Vanessa on the phone a few weeks ago, who's on this panel as well, for the 20 years she had CKD, I asked her, how many times has your physician offered you a trial to participate in? And there she is, and she said none. 20 years, not offered one trial. And so, Vanessa, we're here to change that and make the future different. So I wanted to touch upon this idea of clinical research participation as a care option. And so Kevin had done a survey in the fall. He published this just last month in Kidney News. And so for patients who have never participated in a trial, they noted these reasons. 69% of them never had a doctor or anyone on their care team ask them and discuss it with them. 73% said that had their physician explain the benefits of a trial, that would influence them to participate. So there's a lot written on this across different therapeutic areas. We have more coming specifically in CKD. There's an NKF-sponsored survey that hopefully those results will be published soon. But we want to be where the oncologists are. And so a quote from Dr. Carey, our division chief in oncology at UNC, all of the patients that I treat now, most of their therapy is guided by the trials that went before. By participating in a trial, you're helping a person who's going to be sitting in your seat next year, the year after, 5 years down the road. That's a very real benefit for us as a community. So what I'd like to see in the future is that when a patient gets diagnosed with CKD, like the cancer patients, it's not a matter of, are you going to participate in a trial? It's which one. And so part of this, and we've talked about this in another breakout group, is there is a little bit of marketing that needs to be done, and I think it does start with the patients. We know the pink ribbon. I voted last week on May 8th, not because I knew it was election day, but because someone came to work with an I voted button. And so it's things like this that are simple, and let's just really start the conversation for those of us who still see patients and ask them, are you interested in a clinical trial? Moving on to patients as partners. So in the wise words of one of the most passionate people I've ever met, Celeste Lee, who I know has influenced many of us in this room, researchers and patients speak very different languages. The researcher-patient partnership is hard work, and there are many barriers to overcome. But we do get better at it with practice, and I think we're really accumulating a lot of practice. So the patient perspective, it's not new. We talked about in 1969, Paul mentioned the patient on the Congress floor, and it's been used in FDA advisory committees since 1991. On the left, I've listed some ways, or current ways, that you can stay involved at the FDA. And on the right, I wanted to mention this guidance for industry. PRO measures use in medical product development to support labeling claims. Those last three words are really critical. Like Paul said the other day, we're not here to just check the box and just include patients just for the sake of it, but they are really important. Their feedback is really critical. The FDA wants and needs their insight to help them make decisions. And again, it's law, it's mandated. Many papers have been written about this. I wanted to point out one entitled Guidelines for PRO Use in Clinical Trial Protocols, again, just published last year. And what's happening in CKD? Well, you've heard a lot already today. There was a paper published for FSGS last fall. You heard about a project for vascular access. It's being talked about in the other projects for FSGS and hyperoxaluria. More to come from CureGN, not only for FSGS, but for IgA, membranous, and minimal change. And from the SONG initiative, looking at outcomes for dialysis, PD, PKD, and transplant. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Additionally, Melissa already mentioned that the NKF is planning 3 CKD patient-focused meetings with the FDA, so lots of efforts for us to get involved in. And so, can patient feedback impact drug development? Yes. At the microphone yesterday or this morning, I mentioned this paper on the left, which shows the ROI and value proposition. And I think those of you who are sponsors having trouble convincing your executives to get patient feedback, I think it's worth pulling this paper up. But I want to go to the middle box in regulatory approval. So there was an obesity device trial that didn't meet its original endpoint in 230 patients. The FDA sponsored a survey, went back to patients, 540 patients, and the results of that survey actually indicated that patients would accept the risk of the device for the benefit of weight loss. So the device got approved in 2015, and it was the first of its kind since 2007, and this was based on patient feedback. Finally, something new from just a few months ago, a new section in a drug label, the patient preference data. So rituximab was approved 21 years ago for cancer, and just last year, more studies were done, formulation studies, to get the approval for the sub-Q injection. And so the sponsor asked the patients 3 simple questions about, do you prefer the sub-Q injection, which takes 6 minutes, over the IV infusion that takes 1.5 hours? Well, not surprisingly, the majority of patients said the sub-Q, and this got the sponsor a new section that's never appeared in a drug label before, entitled Patient Experience. Can patient feedback redefine outcomes? The answer is yes, and this has been touched upon a few times in the last day and a half. So the SONG initiative is a standardized outcomes in nephrology. It's a global initiative, and what they're doing is interviewing patients and caregivers as well as healthcare professionals. And you can see on the far left that there is a clear difference in what we prioritize. Healthcare professionals prioritize vascular access problems, death, drops in blood pressure, and hospitalizations. Excuse me. But as you can see, and we've heard already, the priorities for patients are things like the ability to travel, dialysis-free time, feeling washed out after dialysis, and dialysis adequacy. Now, most of us in the room think of dialysis adequacy as a lab, KT over V. Patients don't care. They don't care about KT over V. They care about feeling well enough to get through dialysis and afterwards. But when the ratings were forced, there were more similarities, as you can see in red. And so the SONG initiative has decided that they are going to focus on 4 areas: cardiovascular disease, vascular access, death, and fatigue, to develop outcome sets that will be used in future dialysis trials. So wow, I only have 2 minutes left. I'm going to have to rush a little bit, but quick examples of personalized medicine and CKD. Fabry nephropathy trial published 2 years ago. The main thing I want to point out here is the main criteria for entry was a certain mutation that was deemed responsive to study drug, per the sponsor's own information. The pivotal trials led to approval in a couple regions. It's under FDA priority review. And this is a holy grail of personalized medicine. If you're a doctor taking care of a Fabry patient, you know their mutation, look it up on their website, They'll tell you if it's amenable and responsive to drug, and you put them on that drug. It's an oral therapy given every other day, as opposed to the standard of care, which is an IV infusion every other week. So this is where we hope to see more progress in CKD. So like I said, talking about challenges and trials is really a two-day affair. We were all locked in a room 2 years ago to talk about this. I'll only focus on this kidney-specific outcomes. And so on the right there, I want to point out this observation. Currently, vascular access outcomes are reported in greater than 1,400 different ways. That's astonishing to me. It makes it so hard to understand the data, that variability, and especially compare things. So you already have heard that KHI is working on a lot of projects. The first two up there are on AV access and catheter trial endpoints. You've already heard about all of this today as well from the other work groups. So we've been thinking about novel endpoints in drug development for a while, and in 2012, the FDA partnered with the NKF to come up with an alternative endpoint, 30 or 40% decline in GFR. However, this has limited applicability at endpoints for patients starting at a higher GFR, so those patients with more preserved renal function. Also can't apply to drugs that cause an acute effect on GFR, like SGLT2 inhibitors. So the NKF partnered with the FDA and now with the EMA, and I will tell you that the excitement in the room was palpable. So data was presented on the meta-analysis of 2 million patients to see what markers could predict a treatment's effect on the clinical outcome of progression to kidney failure. You see the surrogate endpoints that are considered candidates right now. We then broke out into different sections to really discuss how this would look like, and the discussion really revolved around how these endpoints can shorten durations and decrease sample size. There's a role in accelerated pathways. We also talked about patient feedback, and as always, the plea and the need for more data sharing, as you've heard today. Want to touch on accelerated approval. The main things to know is that the surrogate endpoint has to have a reasonable likely chance of predicting a clinical benefit, or an intermediate clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier. And of course, there's a requirement for the post-marketing confirmatory trial. So Lisa gave the example of HIV viral loads and cancer. If you see a tumor shrinking on a CAT scan, that's reasonably likely to predict overall survival. So what have we had in CKD? Well, including me, a lot of people have thought that this accelerated pathway was just for rare conditions, and that's not really true. There was an attempt for diabetic kidney disease to go through this pathway, and unfortunately the trial was negative. And I'm happy to report that we've got a trial in phase 3, FSGS, pursuing this pathway. Shorter study duration and smaller numbers of patients. So this is an example of what a design could look like. And so again, a shorter time to get that initial approval, continue the post-marketing confirmatory trial, and then at a longer time point, you see your changes in renal function. Another important meeting that happened 2 months ago was this FDA meeting promoting the use of complex, innovative designs in clinical trials. Very heavy on the statistics, but I want to comment on master protocols because Dr. Woodcock mentioned it yesterday, and she also wrote a review paper on it. So these are being used in cancer trials already. There was a workshop on how to use these in pediatric trials as well, and I don't want us to get behind the ball. I want us to think about this in CKD. So a little bit of a complicated slide. This is one example of a master protocol. It's called the platform trial, and the only thing I want to point out that is at the top, if you have biomarker A for diabetic kidney disease, for example, you can get randomized to drug 1, drug 2, or a shared common standard of care. And so right there you can see the efficiency and how that can preserve sample size. So should we be doing this in DKD? The answer is probably yes. As you can see, these authors commented, this was at the time of the publication, we had 3 large outcome trials going in DKD. Unfortunately, one of them had to stop, but 13,114 patients. In anemia, we know there's some great trials going out there. The collective sample size there is close to 18,000 patients. So think about all those standard of care arms and where we could have preserved sample size. So we've talked about registries as well. And so the NKF has been thinking about this for 2 years. They've convened a small ad board. And we want to look at this from, or at least I'm biased, I want to look at this from a clinical research perspective. We know that 90% of stage 3 patients don't know they have CKD, about half in stage 4. We're probably not looking for it enough, like in the PCP setting. And this has consequences on clinical research. If a patient doesn't know they have a disease, they're not going to the doctor, and of course they're not asking about trial participation. But from the pharma side, it really becomes difficult to estimate the market size. So this is contributing to the reluctance of companies to invest in CKD. So the aims of the registry are listed here. We want to look for patient-reported insight, patient-centered trial design, expand participation in trials, and when the trial ends, there's a chance for post-trial surveillance. I want to say that we've narrowed it down to 3 electronic medical record vendors, and so we hope to start a pilot study soon in 100 patients. And so I ask the questions, are CKD patients internet savvy? I mean, I'm not even on Facebook, so I'm not one to talk. And the answer is yes. At a PCORI meeting looking at dialysis trials last week, I learned about the Kindred study, and this is remarkable. They sent out paper letters to end-stage kidney patients, and within 1 week, 500 patients went online, registered their interest, and signed the online consent. So that just blew my mind. For the patients who were not wanting to go online, they got letters and they were actually texting the study coordinators. So yes, we need to leverage the internet in engaging our patients more. All right, real-world evidence, and let me take a breath here. So what's real-world evidence? Well, this is evidence that's generated in data that's out there in every medical record, claims, pharmacy, labs drawn for insurance, basically anything that's collected outside of the research setting. And the FDA wants this because it can complement the evidence we find in randomized clinical trials. 2 examples from the cardiology literature. So in 2013, the TAVR valve-in-valve procedure received an expanded use approval because of real-world evidence. So everyone who gets this procedure goes into a registry, and at the time they had about 100,000 patients. 600 of those patients underwent an off-label use of this procedure called valve-in-valve, and I'll tell you that my father was one of those patients. So the information was gathered on benefits, risks, safety, function of the valve, and of course patient symptoms, and this data on the 600 patients led to the expanded use approval for the valve-in-valve procedure. This set a precedent to expand the use of other devices with robust registries. It also supports the FDA's plan to establish a national evaluation system for health technology. This will use registries, electronic health records, and claims data to inform their decision-making. Another example from the cardiologist is the TASTE trial. So this is a registry-based, randomized, pragmatic trial. So in Sweden, everyone undergoing a PCI for ST elevation MI gets placed in this registry, but they were able to create 2 arms, the control arm getting the PCI and the randomization arm where the intervention was to manually extract the thrombus before the PCI. And so you're not looking at the results. What you're looking at is an enrollment graph. 7,200 patients at 30 sites over 27 months. That's an enrollment rate of 9 patients per site per month, 9. I'll tell you, in diabetic kidney disease, you've heard this before, it takes us about 4 months to enroll 1 patient for a disease that affects 40 to 50% of our patients. In addition to the benefit of increased and fast enrollment, this was cheap, $300,000. In other words, $50 per subject. So we need to think about how registries in our space can help enable and generate more data. So when you think about RCTs, you start off on the left. Most of us are used to thinking about traditional efficacy trials, where it's basically an artificial setting with very strict criteria and very detailed prospective data collection. As you loosen this criteria, you move into the bucket of pragmatic trials, and we've got the time trial for dialysis. And finally, when you really let loose and liberalize, you can do trials in health insurance systems. Again, it's all about generating data. And I'm not going to go through this, but it's a nice review. And basically, these people were able to collect a massive volume of data, again, everything that exists outside of the research setting. They were able to use local adjudication instead of central, and they were able to have the IRBs waive informed consent. So a faster, quicker ways of generating evidence. And finally, I want to end with telemedicine because this is something I spoke about 2 years ago. So the oncologists, they did it first, and last fall they published this paper. Their question was to ask if a smartphone could replace in-person study visits. They had 15 patients who were initially seen in clinic for consent, and they were given metformin for 6 months. And what happened? Well, there was a 100% completion rate of televisits. We don't get 100% completion rate of study visits in our protocol. Most importantly, 13 of those 15 patients said they would do another trial that was enabled by telemedicine. So I think we need to think about how we can leverage the telehealth implementation that's going to happen in home hemo for future trials. Okay, so I'm sorry I spoke really quickly. I hope there's more time to chat during the QA session, but I hope you have a sense of the momentum that's been building. There's a lot of good work being done. This is a group that met in 2016, and they put out this challenge, which I like to call the 30-30 challenge. As a stretch goal for the community, we propose that 30% of patients with CKD should be involved in relevant clinical trials by 2030. I think all of us in this room have the passion, the energy, and the resources to make this happen, so let's go at it together.